The echoes of empire, wars that defined today's global power structures. In the early 19th century, the world did not yet look inevitable. Borders were not fixed. Power was not consolidated. No single system governed trade, diplomacy, or war. What existed instead was a fragile balance of empires, some ancient, some newly forged, each carrying assumptions about dominance that had not yet been tested by industrial war, global finance, or mass nationalism. It is tempting to imagine that today's global order emerged naturally, as if history simply matured into its present form. In reality, it was hammered into shape through conflict, repeatedly, violently, often unintentionally. The wars that defined modern power structures were not always the largest, nor the most famous. Some unfolded slowly. Some were fought far from Europe's capitals. Some ended not with treaties, but with exhaustion. Others ended with agreements that solved one problem while planting the seeds of several more. What unites them is this: each war altered how power worked, not just who ruled, but how rule itself was understood. Before the modern age of global conflict, empires governed differently. Authority rested on dynasties rather than nations. Armies were professional but limited in size. Economies were regional, not global. War was destructive, but its reach was bounded. That world began to fracture in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Napoleonic Wars did not merely redraw Europe. They shattered the idea that legitimacy flowed solely from monarchy. Mass conscription, national identity, and total mobilization transformed war from a dynastic contest into a societal one. Britain emerged not just victorious, but structurally dominant, its navy controlling trade routes, its financial system underwriting alliances, its industrial capacity setting the pace for global production. Yet even Britain's dominance was conditional. It depended on colonial extraction, maritime supremacy, and the assumption that non-European regions could be controlled indefinitely through force and administration. That assumption would be tested repeatedly, and eventually broken, by wars far from London. At the same time, other empires navigated decline. The Ottoman Empire, once the central power of the Mediterranean world, struggled to modernize its military and bureaucracy at the pace demanded by industrialized rivals. Russia expanded aggressively across Eurasia, yet remained economically fragile. China's Qing dynasty governed vast populations but resisted structural reform, assuming cultural continuity could compensate for military stagnation. These assumptions collided with reality through war. The Opium Wars were not just conflicts over trade. They marked the moment when industrialized warfare exposed the vulnerability of traditional imperial systems. China did not merely lose territory, it lost sovereignty in practice. Unequal treaties reshaped global commerce, introducing a hierarchy that privileged Western powers and normalized economic coercion as a tool of dominance. From this point forward, global power would be inseparable from control over trade, finance, and technology. War was no longer simply about armies meeting on battlefields. It was about infrastructure, logistics, and access, railways, ports, canals, and later oil fields. Empires that failed to adapt were not conquered immediately. They were hollowed out. The Crimean War offers a clear illustration. Often remembered as a diplomatic failure or a military blunder, it was in fact a turning point in global power dynamics. It exposed Russia's logistical weaknesses, demonstrated the importance of industrial supply chains, and revealed that public opinion, amplified through mass media, had become a factor in war itself. For Britain and France, the war reinforced the idea that alliance systems could contain rivals without direct territorial conquest. For Russia, it triggered reforms that reshaped its internal structure, reforms that would later fail under the strain of another, much larger war. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was absorbing its own lessons. The American Civil War was not an imperial conflict in the traditional sense, but its consequences were global. It demonstrated the industrialization of war in its purest form: mass armies, mechanized production, rail-based logistics, and total societal mobilization. More importantly, it consolidated the United States as a unified continental power. After 1865, the United States emerged not merely intact, but transformed. Its industrial capacity surged, its political authority strengthened, its future role as a global actor became possible, not inevitable but possible, because of a war fought internally. By the late 19th century, the world had entered a dangerous phase. Empires expanded rapidly, not because they were stable, but because they feared falling behind. Colonial competition intensified, military alliances hardened, economic interdependence increased without corresponding political coordination. This was not a peaceful globalization, it was a volatile one. The First World War did not erupt from nowhere. It was the culmination of pressures created by earlier wars: industrialization without governance, nationalism without compromise, imperial ambition without restraint. When it ended, the world was irreversibly altered. 4 empires collapsed. New states emerged overnight. The idea of self-determination entered global discourse, unevenly applied, selectively enforced. Financial power shifted decisively toward the United States. Europe's dominance, though not immediately destroyed, was fatally weakened. And yet, the war's settlement did not resolve the structural problems it exposed. It postponed them. The Second World War would finish what the First began. By 1945, global power had been redefined entirely. Colonial empires unraveled. Nuclear weapons transformed the meaning of war itself. 2 superpowers emerged with incompatible ideologies and unprecedented destructive capacity. The Cold War that followed was not an absence of conflict, but a reconfiguration of it. Proxy wars, economic pressure, intelligence operations, and ideological competition replaced direct confrontation. Decolonization accelerated, not always peacefully. New nations inherited borders drawn by empires long gone, often without the institutions necessary to sustain stability. Many of today's conflicts trace their origins to this moment: the Middle East, the Korean Peninsula, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa, Latin America. Each region bears the imprint of wars fought decades or centuries earlier, wars that decided not only who ruled, but how power would function long after armies withdrew. This documentary is not about glorifying war, it is about understanding it as a force that reshaped the world we inhabit. Every major global power today, whether dominant, rising, or declining, stands on foundations laid by conflict. Some benefited, some suffered, most experienced both. To understand today's global power structures, we must trace the echoes. Because wars do not end when treaties are signed, they end when their consequences do. In 1805, as British ships closed in on the combined fleets of France and Spain off Cape Trafalgar, the struggle unfolding at sea was about far more than naval supremacy. It was a contest over how power itself would be organized in the modern world. The Napoleonic Wars are often remembered through towering personalities: Napoleon Bonaparte, Horatio Nelson, Metternich. But their true significance lies elsewhere. They marked the first moment when industrial capacity, financial systems, national identity, and military organization fused into something recognizably modern. The world that emerged afterward did not simply return to equilibrium. It entered a new phase of global hierarchy. Before Napoleon, European wars were largely dynastic. Armies were professional but limited. Civilians suffered, but they were not yet systematically mobilized. States fought to adjust borders or secure succession claims. Even the French Revolutionary Wars initially followed this pattern. Napoleon changed that. Drawing on revolutionary innovations, Napoleon harnessed mass conscription, centralized administration, and merit-based promotion to create armies of unprecedented scale and flexibility. His forces moved faster, lived off the land, and fought with ideological conviction. War was no longer merely an affair of kings, it became an expression of national will. This transformation terrified Europe's old regimes. Austria, Prussia, and Russia were not simply fighting France. They were resisting a new model of power that threatened their internal structures. The wars that followed were therefore existential. Defeat meant not just territorial loss, but political transformation. Yet Napoleon's dominance on land exposed a critical asymmetry. Britain, unlike its continental rivals, did not attempt to match Napoleon army for army. Instead, it leveraged structural advantages, naval supremacy, financial sophistication, and industrial production. The Royal Navy's victory at Trafalgar ensured that Britain would never face invasion. This allowed it to focus on sustaining coalitions, subsidizing allies, and controlling global trade routes. Here, the modern global power dynamic begins to take shape. Britain did not defeat Napoleon alone, but Britain made defeat possible by underwriting the war effort of others. Its banking system, particularly through institutions like the Bank of England and the City of London, enabled long-term credit at a scale no other power could match. This financial dominance would become a cornerstone of British global influence throughout the 19th century. When Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815, the Congress of Vienna sought to restore stability. Borders were redrawn, monarchies reinstated, balance of power diplomacy revived. On the surface, Europe appeared to return to pre-revolutionary norms. In reality, nothing was the same. The wars had demonstrated that states capable of mobilizing entire societies could overwhelm those that could not. Industrial capacity, factories, roads, ports, had become as important as battlefield tactics. Public opinion, fueled by newspapers and nationalist rhetoric, now constrained rulers' choices. Most importantly, Britain emerged as the world's first truly global hegemon. Its dominance was not territorial in the continental sense, it was maritime, financial, and commercial. British ships controlled sea lanes. British merchants dominated trade. British capital flowed into foreign infrastructure, binding distant regions into economic dependence. This system would later be called informal empire, and it proved more durable than outright conquest. The Napoleonic Wars also reshaped Europe's internal hierarchy. Prussia, humiliated by early defeats, embarked on sweeping military and administrative reforms. These reforms, professional officer education, general staff planning, universal service, would later enable German unification and alter the balance of power once again. Russia emerged larger but strained. Its armies marched into Paris, but its economy lagged dangerously behind Western Europe. The contradiction between military ambition and social rigidity would haunt Russia throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Austria survived but stagnated. Increasingly unable to manage its multinational empire amid rising nationalism, France, despite defeat, retained immense cultural and political influence. The Napoleonic Code spread legal uniformity across Europe, shaping governance long after Napoleon's fall. Even in loss, France exported institutional ideas. Beyond Europe, the consequences were equally profound. The disruption of colonial trade during the wars weakened Spain's hold on its American territories. Independence movements gained momentum, leading to the emergence of new states across Latin America. These nations entered the global system economically dependent, politically fragmented, and vulnerable to external influence, conditions that persist in various forms today. The Napoleonic Wars thus did more than reshape Europe. They established a template. Global power would now depend on the ability to mobilize populations, control of trade routes and finance, industrial production, diplomatic coalition building. This template did not remain static. It evolved through later wars, but it never disappeared. Crucially, the wars also revealed a paradox that continues to define global politics. The very mechanisms that create dominance also generate instability. Britain's rise depended on global integration, but integration exposed disparities. National mobilization empowered states, but unleashed forces they could not fully control. The echoes of the Napoleonic era are still audible. Modern alliance systems, global financial hubs, the idea that economic pressure can substitute for direct conquest, even the concept of world order itself traces back to this moment, when Europe first attempted to manage global power through coordinated diplomacy rather than perpetual war. Yet that attempt was incomplete. The system created after 1815 assumed European primacy. It marginalized vast regions of the world. It postponed rather than resolved the tensions between industrial power and political legitimacy. Those tensions would resurface, violently, later in the century. And when they did, the wars that followed would push global power out of Europe entirely. In 1839, when Chinese Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu ordered the destruction of British opium stocks at Canton, he believed he was enforcing law, morality, and sovereignty. From the perspective of the Qing dynasty, the act was reasonable, even restrained. Opium was devastating Chinese society. Foreign merchants were violating imperial regulations. The state was asserting control within its own borders. From the perspective of Britain, it was an intolerable challenge to a new global order. The conflict that followed, the First Opium War, was not merely a dispute over narcotics. It was the collision between two incompatible understandings of power. On one side stood a traditional agrarian empire, confident in cultural continuity and bureaucratic authority. On the other stood an industrialized maritime power that viewed trade, backed by force, as a universal right. The outcome would reshape the global hierarchy in ways still visible today. For centuries, China had been the gravitational center of East Asia. Its economy dwarfed that of Europe well into the 18th century. Foreign traders were tolerated, but tightly controlled. The Canton system confined European merchants to specific ports and intermediaries, reinforcing the assumption that China dictated the terms of engagement. What the Qing court failed to grasp, fatally, was that Britain no longer accepted such limitations. Industrialization had transformed Britain's economy. Mass production demanded markets. Silver shortages made trade imbalances unacceptable. The British East India Company, operating from India, discovered that opium could bridge the gap. When Chinese demand for opium exploded, so did British leverage. The Qing state attempted gradual restriction. It banned opium repeatedly. Enforcement was inconsistent. Corruption flourished. By the time Lin Zexu acted decisively, the situation had already escaped control. Britain's response was swift and asymmetric. The Royal Navy deployed steam-powered gunboats, modern artillery, and disciplined crews. Chinese forces, brave but technologically outmatched, could not respond effectively. Coastal defenses collapsed. Rivers became invasion routes. Entire regions were exposed to bombardment. This was not simply military defeat. It was a revelation. The Qing dynasty confronted a brutal truth. Its understanding of warfare, diplomacy, and international law no longer aligned with reality. Power had shifted, not because China had declined in isolation, but because others had advanced faster and weaponized that advancement. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 formalized this imbalance. China ceded Hong Kong. It opened treaty ports. It fixed tariffs at low rates. It granted extraterritorial rights to British subjects. These provisions were not temporary concessions. They embedded foreign privilege into China's legal and economic system. Subsequent wars, with Britain, France, and later other powers, expanded these terms. By the mid-19th century, China was not colonized outright, but it was no longer sovereign in practice. This model, often described as informal empire, proved highly effective. Western powers gained access to markets without assuming administrative responsibility. Local elites were bypassed, economic dependency deepened, political authority eroded from within. The Opium Wars established a precedent that would be replicated globally. Military superiority enabled economic coercion. Economic coercion reshaped political systems. Treaties became tools of domination rather than mutual agreement. For Britain, the benefits were immense. China became a crucial node in global trade. British merchants expanded operations across East Asia. Financial institutions followed. London consolidated its position as the world's commercial hub. But the war's consequences extended far beyond Britain and China. Japan watched closely. Unlike the Qing court, Japan's leadership drew a different lesson. When American gunboats arrived in 1853, Japan chose rapid modernization rather than resistance. The Meiji Restoration transformed Japan into an industrialized imperial power within decades. This decision, shaped indirectly by China's defeat, would later destabilize East Asia profoundly. Russia, too, took note. Expanding eastward, Russia leveraged China's weakness to extract territory and influence without major conflict. Siberian expansion and access to Pacific ports reshaped Russian strategic horizons. Within China, the effects were catastrophic. Economic disruption intensified social unrest. The Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, cannot be understood without the destabilizing effects of foreign intrusion and weakened authority. The Qing state spent decades suppressing internal revolts while conceding further autonomy to foreign powers. This cycle, external pressure leading to internal fragmentation, would recur across the world. In India, Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, similar dynamics unfolded. Industrialized empires did not always conquer outright. Often, they destabilized existing systems until control became inevitable. The Opium Wars, therefore, represent more than a colonial episode. They mark the moment when industrial capitalism, military technology, and global trade fused into a single system of power. Sovereignty became conditional. Economic access became enforceable by violence. Cultural superiority became assumed rather than argued. This system shaped the modern international order. The concept of free trade, often presented as neutral or benevolent, emerged from coercion. International law evolved unevenly, protecting powerful states while constraining weaker ones. Global inequality hardened into structure. Even today, echoes remain. China's modern foreign policy is deeply shaped by the century of humiliation that began with the Opium Wars. Territorial integrity, economic autonomy, and resistance to external pressure are not abstract principles, they are historical responses. The global power shift that began with gunboats continues to influence diplomacy, trade disputes, and strategic rivalry. The lesson of the Opium Wars is not that technology determines destiny, it is that wars redefine the rules by which power operates. Once those rules change, those who fail to adapt are not merely defeated, they are reorganized. And as the 19th century progressed, this new global system would expand relentlessly, drawing more regions into its orbit. The next major testing ground would lie closer to Europe itself. There, an old empire would confront modern war and expose the weaknesses of a rising continental power. In 1853, the Crimean Peninsula, an outpost of the weakening Ottoman Empire, became the stage for a war that few at the time fully understood. It was framed as a dispute over holy sites and imperial influence. In reality, it was the first modern war in which industrial capacity, logistics, public opinion, and alliance management proved as decisive as battlefield courage. The Crimean War did not create a new global order overnight. Instead, it revealed cracks in the existing one, cracks that would widen dramatically over the next 60 years. At its core, the conflict was about containment. Russia sought to expand its influence southward, exploiting Ottoman decline to secure access to warm water ports and project power into the Mediterranean. Britain and France, wary of Russian dominance near key trade routes and colonial interests, intervened not to save the Ottomans, but to preserve balance. This logic, intervening to prevent a rival from gaining structural advantage, would later become central to global power politics. On paper, Russia appeared formidable. It possessed vast territory, a massive army, and a tradition of resilience. But the Crimean War exposed a fatal weakness. Russia could not sustain modern warfare. Its economy remained largely agrarian. Its transportation network was primitive. Its command structure was rigid. Mobilization was slow, supply unreliable, and innovation resisted. By contrast, Britain and France brought industrial tools to the battlefield. Steam-powered ships transported troops and supplies, railways moved men and materiel efficiently, telegraph lines transmitted information rapidly. War correspondents reported events in near real time, shaping public perception. For the first time, a war was fought under the gaze of mass media. The siege of Sevastopol became emblematic of this new reality. Soldiers endured appalling conditions. Logistics failed catastrophically. Disease killed more men than combat. These failures were documented and broadcast, fueling political pressure at home. Florence Nightingale's work in military medicine, often celebrated as humanitarian progress, was itself a response to industrial-scale suffering. War had outpaced existing systems of care. The Crimean War thus introduced a new dimension: accountability. Governments could no longer wage war without scrutiny. Public opinion mattered. Parliamentary inquiries followed. Reforms were demanded. For Britain, this led to administrative modernization. For France, it reinforced the link between military success and imperial prestige. For Russia, the consequences were existential. Defeat triggered a wave of internal reforms, most notably the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. The state recognized that social rigidity was incompatible with modern power. Yet reform was incomplete and uneven, planting tensions that would later explode. The Ottoman Empire, nominally defended, emerged weakened and indebted. Its reliance on European loans increased. Sovereignty eroded quietly through financial dependence. This pattern, military survival paired with economic subordination, would recur across the globe. The Crimean War also reshaped alliance dynamics. Britain and France discovered the difficulties of coalition warfare. Coordination problems, mistrust, and divergent objectives hampered effectiveness. These lessons would later inform more structured alliance systems, such as those preceding the First World War. Importantly, the war signaled a shift in how power was measured. Territory mattered less than infrastructure. Manpower mattered less than organization. Courage mattered less than supply. Industrial capacity became the hidden determinant of victory. This realization had profound implications. States that industrialized rapidly, Germany, the United States, Japan, would soon challenge established powers. Those that did not adapt, Ottoman Turkey, Qing China, Tsarist Russia, would face decline, fragmentation, or revolution. The Crimean War also influenced military thought. It demonstrated the lethal power of modern rifles, the vulnerability of massed assaults, and the necessity of combined arms. These lessons were observed, debated, and often ignored, until catastrophe forced recognition. In this sense, the war was a warning. It showed what modern war could become without fully revealing how devastating it would be when industrialized societies mobilized entirely. That revelation would come later. Beyond Europe, the Crimean War reinforced a pattern of selective intervention. Great powers would intervene not to conquer directly, but to prevent rivals from gaining advantage. This logic underpinned later conflicts in the Balkans, the Middle East, and Asia. It also laid groundwork for a world increasingly divided into spheres of influence. By the late 19th century, this system would expand globally, entangling distant regions in European rivalries. Yet the Crimean War also marked the beginning of Europe's long decline. It demonstrated that even victorious powers were strained by modern war. Costs escalated. Casualties mounted, public tolerance eroded. Victory no longer guaranteed stability. The industrial tools that enabled dominance also amplified vulnerability. This paradox, power gained through systems that ultimately destabilize, would define the next century. As Europe modernized its warfare, it inadvertently set the stage for conflicts of unprecedented scale. The next major war to redefine global power would not be fought between empires alone. It would be fought within a single nation, and its consequences would extend far beyond its borders. In April 1861, when Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter, the event was understood primarily as a domestic rupture. A constitutional crisis had become armed conflict. Few observers, inside or outside the United States, grasped that the war about to unfold would redefine not only America's future, but the nature of modern power itself. The American Civil War was not an imperial war in the European sense. It was not fought for colonies or dynastic claims, yet in its scale, intensity, and consequences, it marked a decisive turning point in global history. It demonstrated what industrial war looked like when a society mobilized almost entirely, and what emerged on the other side. Before 1861, the United States was a growing republic with significant internal contradictions. Its economy was expanding rapidly but unevenly. Its political institutions were stable but fragile. Its global influence was limited, constrained by distance, internal division, and relative military inexperience. The Civil War changed all of this. At its core, the conflict was a struggle over the future structure of the American state. Would it remain a loose federation of sovereign entities, or become a centralized nation with supreme federal authority? The answer would determine not only domestic governance, but the country's capacity to act beyond its borders. The war forced that answer. Both the Union and the Confederacy mobilized on a scale unprecedented in the Western Hemisphere. Millions of men were conscripted or volunteered. Railroads became arteries of war. Factories turned out weapons, uniforms, and ammunition in staggering quantities. Telegraph lines transmitted orders across vast distances, compressing time and space. This was industrial warfare in its purest early form. Battles like Antietam, Gettysburg, and Shiloh revealed the brutal mismatch between traditional tactics and modern firepower. Casualties soared, defensive positions dominated, entire regions were devastated not as byproducts, but as deliberate strategy. General William Tecumseh Sherman's march through Georgia crystallized a new doctrine: war against an enemy's capacity to sustain itself. Infrastructure, industry, and civilian morale became legitimate targets. This approach horrified contemporaries and forecast the logic of 20th century total war. The Union's victory was not inevitable. The Confederacy fought with determination, capable leadership, and initial strategic advantages. But it lacked what modern power increasingly required: industrial depth, financial resilience, and logistical reach. Its economy could not sustain prolonged conflict. Its transportation networks were limited. Its diplomatic efforts failed to secure decisive foreign intervention. The Union, by contrast, harnessed its industrial base relentlessly. Northern factories expanded. Agricultural output surged. Immigration continued. Financial institutions developed new mechanisms to fund war, including national banking systems and public debt on an unprecedented scale. These innovations did not disappear in 1865. They became permanent features of American power. When the war ended, the United States was transformed. Federal authority had been decisively established. Slavery was abolished, removing a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Republic. The national government emerged stronger, more centralized, and more capable of mobilizing resources. Equally important, the United States had learned how to fight modern war. This knowledge was not immediately projected outward. In the decades following the Civil War, America focused on internal expansion and consolidation. But the foundations of global power were laid quietly. Railroads knit the continent together. Industrial output exploded. Financial markets deepened. The United States became, in effect, a continental empire, one unified by infrastructure rather than colonies. International observers noticed. European military theorists studied the Civil War closely. Prussian officers analyzed its battles, logistics, and command structures. Lessons drawn from American rail mobilization and mass armies influenced the wars of German unification and later European conflicts. The war also altered global economic relationships. The disruption of southern cotton exports forced Britain and France to seek alternative suppliers, accelerating colonial expansion in India and Egypt. Global trade networks shifted. The war's economic shockwaves extended far beyond American shores. Politically, the Civil War reshaped ideas of sovereignty and legitimacy. It demonstrated that a state could survive internal rebellion only by asserting centralized authority. This lesson resonated in Europe, where nationalist movements were reshaping multi-ethnic empires. It also foreshadowed the challenges colonial powers would face as subject populations demanded self-determination. Yet, the Civil War's most enduring impact lay in what it made possible. By the end of the 19th century, the United States possessed the industrial capacity, population base, and political cohesion to become a global power. What it lacked was incentive. That incentive would arrive with the collapse of Europe's imperial system in the 20th century. The Civil War thus occupies a paradoxical place in global history. It was intensely local, deeply rooted in American political conflict. Yet it produced a state capable of reshaping global order when circumstances demanded it. Without the Civil War, there is no United States as a 20th century superpower. And without that superpower, the world that emerged after two world wars would look profoundly different. The lesson is subtle but critical. Wars do not always project their consequences outward immediately. Sometimes they restructure a society internally, creating latent power that emerges later when global conditions shift. The American Civil War did exactly that. It forged a modern state through catastrophe, embedding industrial capacity, centralized authority, and mass mobilization into the fabric of governance. Those features would define global power in the century to come. As the 19th century drew to a close, the world stood at a crossroads. Industrialization had spread. Empires had expanded aggressively. Nationalism had intensified. Alliance systems hardened. The tools of mass war were now widely available. The next conflict to redefine global power would not be confined to one nation or one region. It would engulf the world. In the summer of 1914, Europe entered a war that many of its leaders believed would be short, decisive, and contained. The assumptions were disastrously wrong. What followed was not simply a larger war than those that came before, it was a fundamentally different kind of conflict. The First World War did not just redraw borders or replace governments. It shattered the political, economic, and imperial foundations that had supported European global dominance for centuries. By the time the war ended in 1918, the world's center of gravity had begun to shift irreversibly away from Europe. The origins of the conflict lay deep in the 19th century. Industrialization had created immense wealth, but it had also intensified competition. Germany's rapid rise after unification in 1871 unsettled the balance of power. Britain remained dominant at sea, but faced growing industrial rivalry. France sought security and revenge after defeat in 1870. Austria-Hungary struggled to manage its multinational empire. Russia expanded territorially while remaining internally fragile. All of these tensions were contained, uneasily, through alliances and diplomacy. But containment had limits. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was not the cause of the war so much as the trigger that exposed how rigid and dangerous the international system had become. Mobilization schedules, alliance obligations, and strategic assumptions pushed states into conflict faster than diplomacy could restrain them. Once war began, it escalated beyond control. Industrial capacity transformed battlefields into killing grounds. Machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas, and later tanks and aircraft multiplied lethality. Defensive firepower overwhelmed offensive doctrine. Millions of soldiers were trapped in trench systems stretching across continents. For the first time, entire societies were mobilized for war. Factories produced weapons around the clock. Women entered industrial labor at unprecedented levels. Governments rationed food, controlled information, and reorganized economies. Civilian populations became targets through blockade, bombardment, and starvation. The distinction between front and home front blurred. Europe paid an enormous price. Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire all collapsed during or immediately after the war. Dynasties that had ruled for centuries vanished. New states emerged: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, but often without stable institutions or secure borders. The war solved some problems only by creating many more. The Treaty of Versailles punished Germany severely but ambiguously It imposed territorial losses, military restrictions, and reparations without providing a viable path to political reintegration. Germany remained powerful enough to resent defeat, but constrained enough to feel humiliated. This imbalance would prove catastrophic. Austria-Hungary's dissolution fragmented Central Europe into smaller states, vulnerable to pressure from larger neighbors. The Ottoman Empire's collapse left the Middle East divided by externally imposed borders, many of which ignored ethnic, religious, and historical realities. These decisions were not accidents. They reflected imperial priorities, strategic convenience, and the assumption that European powers could manage global order indefinitely, even as their own capacities were declining. The war also transformed the global economy. European powers emerged deeply indebted, particularly to the United States. Britain retained imperial reach but lost financial supremacy. France suffered massive destruction. Germany's economy was destabilized. Russia withdrew into revolution and civil war. The United States, by contrast, emerged strengthened. It entered the war late, suffered relatively limited casualties, and became the world's principal creditor. American industry expanded dramatically. The dollar began its long ascent as a global currency. For the first time, Europe depended on American power to stabilize its own system. This shift marked the beginning of the end of European global primacy. The First World War also altered the ideological landscape. The Russian Revolution of 1917 introduced a new form of power based on revolutionary ideology rather than empire. Communism would challenge capitalist systems for the rest of the century, reshaping global alignments and conflicts. National self-determination entered political discourse, championed rhetorically but applied selectively. Colonized peoples heard the language of freedom and equality and began to demand it for themselves. The war thus planted the seeds of decolonization, even as empires attempted to preserve control. The League of Nations, established to prevent future conflict, embodied both ambition and weakness. It lacked enforcement power. Key states refused participation. Sovereignty remained paramount. The system relied on cooperation without providing mechanisms to compel it. As a result, the post-war order was fragile from the start. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the First World War was psychological. It destroyed faith in progress. It exposed the capacity of modern societies to annihilate themselves. It normalized mass death and political extremism. The war did not end global conflict. It reorganized it. Power shifted away from Europe toward new centers. The rules governing war, diplomacy, and economy were rewritten, but incompletely. Old empires fell, but no stable replacement system emerged. The world entered an interwar period defined by unresolved tensions, economic instability, and ideological polarization. The First World War had ended the old order, but it had not yet produced a new one. That task would fall to an even more destructive conflict, one that would complete the transformation of global power structures and define the world we inhabit today. When the Second World War began in 1939, it was widely understood as a continuation of unresolved tensions from the First World War. What was not yet understood was the extent to which this conflict would complete the collapse of the old imperial system and construct an entirely new architecture of global power. The Second World War did not merely rearrange borders or replace governments. It redefined what power meant, who possessed it, and how it could be exercised. By 1945, the world that emerged bore little resemblance to the one that had existed even 20 years earlier. The war began in Europe, but it was global from the start. Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland exposed the failure of interwar diplomacy and collective security. Britain and France declared war, But their initial response revealed how deeply weakened Europe had become. The rapid collapse of France in 1940, once considered the continent's strongest military power, shattered any remaining illusion of European stability. Germany's early victories were not solely the result of superior tactics. They reflected structural advantages, centralized planning, mobilized industry, and a willingness to integrate air, armor, and communications in ways other states had been slow to adopt. Yet even these advantages carried limits. Germany could conquer rapidly, but it could not sustain a prolonged global war. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 marked the turning point. What Germany framed as a decisive ideological and territorial campaign became a war of attrition on a scale unprecedented in history. The Eastern Front consumed resources, manpower, and industrial capacity at a staggering rate. At the same time, the war expanded decisively beyond Europe. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States fully into the conflict. In doing so, it transformed the war's balance irreversibly. American industrial capacity dwarfed that of any other participant. Its geographic position insulated it from direct devastation. Its population and economy could be mobilized without the immediate existential pressures faced by Europe and Asia. The United States did not merely join the war, it redefined it. Factories across the country converted to wartime production. Aircraft, ships, tanks, and munitions were produced in quantities that overwhelmed Axis capacity. Logistics became a weapon. Supply chains stretched across oceans, supported by naval dominance and industrial redundancy. This was power exercised structurally, not just militarily. Britain, though battered, adapted by aligning itself fully with American production and finance. The Anglo-American alliance became the backbone of the Allied war effort, signaling a transfer of leadership within the Western world. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union absorbed unimaginable losses while mobilizing its economy with brutal efficiency. Entire industries were relocated eastward. Civilian populations endured extreme deprivation. Victory came at extraordinary human cost, but it established the Soviet Union as a superpower. By 1945, Europe was devastated. Cities lay in ruins. Economies were shattered. Empires that had once dominated global affairs could barely sustain themselves. Britain emerged victorious but exhausted, dependent on American loans. France survived but diminished. Germany was destroyed and divided. The war completed Europe's decline as the center of global power. In its place emerged a bipolar system dominated by two states whose power rested not on colonial empires but on industrial capacity, ideological mobilization, and technological dominance. The United States and the Soviet Union did not simply win the war. They inherited the world. The institutions created in the war's aftermath reflected this shift. The United Nations replaced the League of Nations, incorporating enforcement mechanisms that acknowledged the realities of power. The Bretton Woods system established financial structures, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, anchored by American economic dominance. The U.S. dollar became the backbone of global finance. Military power, too, was transformed. Nuclear weapons fundamentally altered the calculus of war. For the first time, direct conflict between great powers risked annihilation. Deterrence replaced conquest. Strategy became inseparable from existential risk. This technological threshold restructured international relations permanently. Colonial empires unraveled rapidly after the war. European powers lacked the resources and legitimacy to maintain control. Anti-colonial movements, strengthened by wartime mobilization and ideological rhetoric, pressed for independence. India, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East entered a new phase of political transformation. Yet decolonization did not produce stability. New states inherited borders drawn by imperial powers, economies structured for extraction, and institutions ill-suited to self-governance. Many became arenas for Cold War competition, their internal conflicts shaped by external power struggles. The Second World War thus created a paradoxical world. It ended formal empire but intensified global hierarchy. It destroyed old power structures but replaced them with new ones that were no less consequential. The war also embedded a lasting belief that global order required active management. Isolation was no longer viable. Economic interdependence, military alliances, and ideological competition bound states together. Security became collective, whether through NATO, the Warsaw Pact, or other regional arrangements. This belief continues to shape international policy today. The Second World War's legacy is therefore not confined to memorials or anniversaries. It lives in institutions, alliances, currencies, and strategic doctrines. It determines which states possess veto power, which currencies dominate trade, which conflicts draw international intervention. The war closed one era of empire. It opened another, one defined not by territorial conquest, but by systems of influence that reach far beyond borders. Understanding today's global power structures requires recognizing this continuity. The world did not become peaceful after 1945. It became structured, and that structure, fragile, contested, and deeply unequal, was forged in the crucible of the most destructive war in human history. When the Second World War ended, it did not deliver peace in any traditional sense. Instead, it produced a condition unprecedented in history, a global system dominated by two superpowers whose direct confrontation risked total destruction. The conflict that followed, the Cold War, was defined not by the absence of war, but by its transformation. The Cold War redefined how power was exercised, constrained, and projected. It was a struggle conducted across continents without a single decisive battlefield. Its weapons were not only tanks and missiles, but ideology, economics, technology, and influence. And although it ended without a formal peace treaty, its effects continue to shape global power structures today. At the heart of the Cold War lay a structural contradiction. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from the Second World War as the world's dominant powers, but their foundations could not have been more different. The United States rested on a capitalist economy integrated into global markets, supported by democratic institutions and naval reach. The Soviet Union relied on centralized planning, ideological cohesion, and control over contiguous territory. Each system viewed the other not merely as a rival, but as a threat to its legitimacy. Nuclear weapons ensured that direct war was unthinkable. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had demonstrated that modern conflict could annihilate civilization itself. As both sides acquired nuclear arsenals, deterrence replaced conquest as the primary logic of power. This created a paradoxical stability. Neither side could afford to attack the other directly, yet neither could accept the expansion of the rival's influence. As a result, competition shifted into indirect forms: proxy wars, economic pressure, intelligence operations, and ideological contestation. The Cold War was therefore fought everywhere and nowhere at once. Europe became the first frontier. The division of Germany symbolized the new order. Western Europe, aided by the Marshall Plan, integrated economically under American leadership. This was not purely altruistic. Economic recovery stabilized democratic governments and created markets for American goods. It also ensured political alignment. Eastern Europe, by contrast, fell under Soviet control. Through a combination of military presence, political pressure, and institutional restructuring, the Soviet Union established satellite regimes. These states retained nominal sovereignty, but their policies were tightly constrained. This division institutionalized a bipolar world. Military alliances formalized the split. NATO bound Western Europe to American security guarantees. The Warsaw Pact organized Soviet-controlled states under a unified military structure. These alliances did not merely deter aggression, they embedded dependency. Security became collective, but not equal. Outside Europe, the Cold War's most violent episodes unfolded. In Korea, a civil conflict hardened into a proxy war that drew in both superpowers. The war ended without resolution, freezing the peninsula into two rival states. That division remains one of the most enduring legacies of Cold War geopolitics. In Vietnam, a nationalist struggle against colonial rule became entangled in global ideological rivalry. The United States intervened to prevent the spread of communism. The Soviet Union and China supported the opposing side. The war exposed the limits of military power in asymmetric conflicts and profoundly reshaped American foreign policy. In the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, similar patterns emerged. Decolonization created new states whose internal stability was fragile. Superpowers competed for influence by supporting regimes, insurgencies, or coups aligned with their interests. Ideological alignment often mattered more than governance quality or popular legitimacy. The result was a series of prolonged conflicts whose human costs were enormous and whose consequences persist. The Cold War also reshaped global economics. The United States promoted an international system based on open markets, currency convertibility, and trade integration. Institutions created after the Second World War facilitated this system, but power within them was unevenly distributed. The Soviet bloc pursued economic autarky within its sphere, prioritizing industrial capacity and military production over consumer welfare. This approach enabled rapid early development, but proved inflexible over time. Competition extended into technology and culture. The space race was not about exploration alone. It was a demonstration of scientific, industrial, and ideological capability. Achievements in space translated into prestige and strategic confidence. Similarly, cultural influence became a form of power. Media, education, and even sports became arenas of competition. The Cold War was fought as much in perceptions as in policy. Despite its global reach, the Cold War imposed constraints. Superpowers learned to manage crises carefully. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed how close miscalculation could bring catastrophe. Afterward, mechanisms for communication and arms control emerged, not out of trust, but necessity. This period produced a new understanding of power, one that emphasized restraint as much as projection. Yet restraint was unevenly applied. While nuclear-armed states avoided direct war, conventional conflicts devastated regions lacking such deterrence. The Cold War preserved stability at the center while exporting instability to the periphery. When the Cold War ended, it did so quietly. The Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of economic stagnation, political rigidity, and internal contradiction. There was no decisive battle, no negotiated surrender. The bipolar system dissolved, leaving the United States as the world's sole superpower. But the structures created during the Cold War did not disappear. Alliances remained, institutions endured, military doctrines persisted. Many regional conflicts froze rather than resolved. New states inherited Cold War legacies without Cold War certainties. The Cold War, therefore, did not end the era of empire. It transformed it. Power shifted from territorial control to systems of influence. Military dominance became inseparable from economic integration and technological leadership. Ideology lost some of its clarity, but competition endured. Understanding today's global power structures, whether in Europe, Asia, or the developing world, requires recognizing how deeply they were shaped by this long, indirect war. The echoes of the Cold War remain embedded in borders, alliances, and strategic assumptions, and as the bipolar system gave way to a more fragmented world, new conflicts emerged. Conflicts that tested whether the post-Cold War order could sustain itself without the rigid stability that had once constrained it. In the decades following the Second World War, much of the world entered a period of rapid political transformation that was often described at the time as liberation. Empires dissolved. Flags were lowered. New states emerged across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. On paper, this was the triumph of self-determination. In practice, it was one of the most violent and destabilizing periods in modern history. Decolonization was not a single process, nor was it peaceful by default. It was shaped by war, sometimes open, sometimes undeclared, between colonial powers seeking to preserve influence and nationalist movements determined to seize it. These conflicts did not merely decide who governed newly independent states. They defined how those states would function within the global power system. The wars of decolonization created what is often called the global periphery, regions formally sovereign yet structurally constrained. The French War in Indochina offers an early and revealing example. France attempted to reassert control over its Southeast Asian colonies after 1945, framing the struggle as a restoration of order. Vietnamese nationalists, led by Ho Chi Minh, framed it as anti-imperial resistance. Both sides understood that the conflict was about legitimacy as much as territory. The defeat of France at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 was decisive. It marked the first time a European colonial power was defeated outright by a nationalist army using a combination of guerrilla warfare, popular mobilization, and strategic patience. The psychological impact was immense. Colonial rule was no longer assumed to be permanent. Yet independence did not bring stability. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam temporarily, creating conditions for a much larger war. The conflict that followed would draw in global powers, demonstrating how decolonization wars became entangled in Cold War rivalry. A similar pattern unfolded in Algeria. France considered Algeria not a colony, but an integral part of the French state. When Algerian nationalists launched an armed revolt in 1954, the response was brutal. Counterinsurgency operations included torture, mass detention, and collective punishment. The war exposed the moral and political contradictions of empire. France ultimately retained military control but lost political legitimacy. Independence came in 1962, accompanied by deep trauma and division, both in Algeria and within French society itself. Across Africa, the process was uneven. Some territories gained independence through negotiation. Others experienced prolonged conflict. In Kenya, British forces fought the Mau Mau uprising using detention camps and emergency laws. In Angola and Mozambique, Portuguese refusal to decolonize led to decades of war that devastated local societies. These conflicts were not isolated. They were shaped by global power structures that offered limited choices. New states emerged with economies designed for extraction, borders drawn without regard to local realities, and institutions modeled on colonial administration rather than participatory governance. War became the mechanism through which these contradictions were managed or exacerbated. In the Middle East, decolonization intersected with strategic rivalry and unresolved imperial legacies. The creation of Israel in 1948, following the collapse of the British Mandate in Palestine, produced a regional conflict that has persisted for generations. The Arab-Israeli wars were shaped not only by local dynamics, but by superpower involvement, arms transfers, and diplomatic alignment. Similarly, the partition of India in 1947, conducted hastily as Britain withdrew, triggered mass violence, displacement, and enduring rivalry between India and Pakistan. The borders drawn during decolonization became fault lines for future wars. These conflicts mattered not only regionally. They redefined global power relationships by creating states that were formally independent but strategically dependent. Security assistance, development aid, and military alliances tied many post-colonial states to external powers. This dependence was not always imposed. New leaders often sought patronage to consolidate authority or counter rivals. In doing so, they embedded their countries within global power networks that limited autonomy. Decolonization wars also transformed military doctrine. Guerrilla warfare, insurgency, and counterinsurgency became central concerns for global powers. Conventional military superiority proved insufficient against decentralized resistance movements rooted in local populations. This lesson was learned repeatedly and often ignored. The wars produced a generation of states shaped by conflict from inception. Armed struggle became a source of legitimacy. Militarized politics persisted after independence. Civil-military relations were distorted. Institutions designed for war proved ill-suited for peace. As a result, many post-colonial states experienced cycles of instability, coups, and internal conflict. These patterns were not inherent. They were consequences of how independence was achieved and how power was distributed afterward. The global system absorbed these states unevenly. Some, such as India, managed to build durable institutions despite enormous challenges. Others remained trapped in cycles of dependency and violence. The difference often lay in the degree of institutional continuity, economic diversification, and strategic autonomy available at independence. Decolonization wars thus reshaped the global order in subtle but lasting ways. They ended formal empire, but they did not eliminate hierarchy. Power became less visible, more indirect. Economic structures replaced territorial control. Influence replaced rule. The global periphery was created not by failure alone, but by the violent transition from empire to nation-state within an international system not designed for equality. Many of today's global challenges, fragile states, regional conflicts, humanitarian crises, are rooted in this period. The wars of decolonization did not conclude history's great power struggles. They relocated them. As colonial empires faded, competition among major powers adapted. Influence was exercised through alliances, economic leverage, and proxy conflicts rather than direct rule. The next stage in this evolution would test whether the post-Cold War world could transcend these patterns or merely reproduce them under new conditions. When the Cold War ended, many policymakers and commentators believed history itself had turned a corner. The collapse of the Soviet Union appeared to leave the United States without a peer competitor. Liberal democracy and market capitalism seemed ascendant. War, it was hoped, would become an anomaly rather than a structural feature of international politics. This optimism proved premature. The post-Cold War era did not eliminate conflict. Instead, it revealed how deeply war had been woven into global power structures and how those structures adapted when bipolar rivalry disappeared. The 1990s opened with a demonstration of overwhelming military dominance. The Gulf War of 1991 showcased the United States at the height of its unipolar power. A broad international coalition expelled Iraqi forces from Kuwait in a matter of weeks. Precision-guided munitions, satellite intelligence, and integrated command systems produced a victory that appeared decisive and clean. For many observers, this war symbolized a new era. It suggested that advanced technology, coalition legitimacy, and rapid intervention could enforce international norms without prolonged occupation or instability. The lesson drawn, incorrectly, was that power had become controllable. In reality, the Gulf War masked deeper structural challenges. Iraq was defeated militarily, but not politically integrated into a stable regional order. Sanctions, no-fly zones, and containment strategies created prolonged suffering without resolution. The war solved an immediate crisis while leaving underlying tensions intact. This pattern would recur. In the Balkans, the disintegration of Yugoslavia exposed the limits of international institutions. Ethnic conflict erupted amid the collapse of centralized authority. European powers hesitated. The United Nations proved unable to prevent mass atrocities. Only sustained NATO intervention halted the violence. These wars revealed a critical truth. The end of superpower rivalry had not produced effective mechanisms for conflict management. Instead, it removed constraints. During the Cold War, local conflicts were often frozen by fear of escalation. Afterward, suppressed tensions reemerged violently. Borders drawn during imperial and Cold War eras proved unstable. Nationalism returned as a potent force. Meanwhile, global power remained asymmetric. The United States possessed unmatched military capacity, but its ability to shape outcomes proved limited. Intervention could stop violence temporarily, but building durable political order required local legitimacy, economic development, and institutional capacity, factors external powers struggled to provide. The attacks of September 11, 2001 marked a decisive turning point. They exposed a vulnerability inherent in globalization. Power concentrated in networks rather than territories could strike asymmetrically. Non-state actors could leverage technology, finance, and ideology to challenge even the most powerful states. The wars that followed, in Afghanistan and Iraq, were framed as responses to terrorism. They also reflected deeper assumptions about power. The invasion of Afghanistan initially succeeded in dismantling the Taliban regime, but the subsequent effort to construct a centralized state in a fragmented society proved far more difficult. The war dragged on for 2 decades, illustrating the limits of military superiority in reshaping political realities. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was even more consequential. It was undertaken not to repel aggression, but to preempt perceived threats and reshape the Middle East. The collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime was swift. What followed was chaos. The dismantling of Iraqi institutions created a power vacuum. Sectarian violence escalated. Regional rivalries intensified. The war destabilized not only Iraq, but the broader region, contributing to the rise of extremist groups and prolonged conflict. These wars revealed a fundamental contradiction of the post-Cold War order. Unipolar power enabled intervention, but not control. Military dominance did not translate into political legitimacy. The assumption that liberal institutions could be rapidly transplanted into war-torn societies proved deeply flawed. At the same time, other powers adapted. Russia, weakened in the 1990s, began reasserting influence through selective intervention and hybrid strategies. The wars in Georgia and Ukraine reflected a willingness to challenge post-Cold War boundaries when strategic interests were threatened. China pursued a different path. Rather than military expansion, it focused on economic integration. Trade, infrastructure investment, and financial leverage became tools of influence. The absence of major wars involving China did not signal passivity. It reflected strategic patience. Meanwhile, regional powers asserted themselves. Iran expanded influence through proxy networks. Turkey projected power into neighboring regions. India navigated a complex environment, balancing growth with security concerns. None sought global dominance, but all reshaped regional dynamics. The post-Cold War period thus revealed a fragmented world. No single power could impose order. Institutions designed for a bipolar system struggled to adapt. Conflicts became more localized but no less consequential. War shifted again. It became less about formal declarations and more about prolonged instability. Cyber operations, economic sanctions, information warfare, and proxy conflicts blurred traditional definitions of war. The global power structures forged by earlier conflicts remained in place, but their operation became less predictable. This unpredictability defines the present moment. The belief that history had ended underestimated the persistence of structural inequality, unresolved borders, and contested legitimacy. Wars continued to define power, not by producing clear victors, but by exposing limitations. Understanding this period requires abandoning the illusion of linear progress. The post-Cold War world is not a departure from historical patterns. It is their continuation under new conditions. Empires no longer rule directly, but influence, dependency, and conflict remain central to how power is organized. The echoes of earlier wars, Napoleonic, Imperial, World, and Cold War, resonate in every contemporary crisis. The final task is not to identify a single war that defines the present. It is to recognize how layers of conflict accumulated over centuries continue to shape who holds power and who bears its consequences. History rarely announces when it is finished shaping the present. The wars that defined today's global power structures did not end cleanly. They did not resolve themselves neatly into peace treaties or stable borders. Instead, they layered consequences upon consequences, embedding decisions made under pressure into institutions, economies, and assumptions that persist long after the shooting stopped. What we call the modern world is not the product of one decisive conflict. It is the accumulation of many. From the Napoleonic Wars onward, war ceased to be merely a contest over territory. It became a mechanism for reorganizing global systems, finance, trade, legitimacy, technology, and authority. Each major conflict altered how power functioned, not just who possessed it. This is why the echoes remain so persistent. The British-led global system that emerged after Napoleon was not dismantled by moral awakening or diplomatic reform. It was weakened by the costs of industrial war, challenged by rival models of power, and ultimately displaced by conflicts that Europe could no longer afford to dominate. The Opium Wars demonstrated that industrial and economic power could override sovereignty without formal conquest. This logic did not disappear. It evolved into modern forms of coercion, sanctions, trade leverage, debt dependency, that continue to shape international relations. The Crimean War revealed that military strength without industrial and logistical capacity was hollow. That lesson remains relevant in an age where supply chains, technology, and infrastructure matter as much as battlefield success. The American Civil War showed how internal conflict could forge a state capable of global power. It reminds us that wars do not only destroy, they reorganize societies internally, creating capacities that emerge later on the world stage. The First World War ended Europe's unquestioned dominance, but failed to replace it with a stable order. The Second World War completed that transformation, creating a system defined not by empire, but by superpower rivalry, nuclear deterrence, and institutionalized influence. The Cold War demonstrated that war could be avoided at the center while exported to the margins. Its legacy is visible in frozen conflicts, militarized states, and regions shaped more by strategic necessity than by local agency. Decolonization wars ended formal empire but created a global periphery, states independent in name, constrained in practice. Their struggles were not the result of cultural failure or inevitability, but of the violent conditions under which independence was achieved and the unequal system into which it was born. The post-Cold War era revealed that dominance without legitimacy produces instability. Military superiority could remove regimes, but it could not manufacture political order. Power fragmented rather than consolidated. Across all these periods, a pattern emerges. Wars do not simply rearrange power. They redefine the rules by which power operates. They determine which currencies dominate global trade, which institutions set the rules, which borders are treated as fixed and which are contested, which forms of violence are tolerated and which are condemned. These outcomes persist because they are embedded into systems rather than enforced constantly by force. This is why the present moment feels unstable. The global order built after the Second World War is under strain. Institutions designed for a bipolar or unipolar world struggle to manage a multipolar reality. Economic interdependence creates vulnerability as well as prosperity. Technology accelerates conflict without clear thresholds. Yet none of this is unprecedented. It is the continuation of a historical process in which war has repeatedly acted as the engine of structural change. The difference today is not that war has disappeared, but that its forms have multiplied. Economic, cyber, informational, and proxy conflicts operating alongside conventional force. Understanding today's global power structures requires resisting two temptations. The first is nostalgia, for a past era imagined as more stable, more orderly, more legitimate. That stability often rested on exclusion, coercion, and inequality. The second is fatalism, the belief that conflict is inevitable and therefore unexamined. History shows that while war reshapes systems, it does not determine outcomes alone. Decisions made during and after conflict matter profoundly. The world we inhabit is not the inevitable end point of history. It is the product of choices made under pressure, compromises struck imperfectly, and power exercised with consequences not fully understood at the time. Recognizing the echoes of empire does not mean accepting them as permanent. It means understanding where today's structures came from, why they persist, and how they might change. Because the most important lesson of the wars that defined global power is this: war ends, but the systems it creates endure, and unless they are examined, questioned, and adapted, they will continue to shape the future. Quietly, relentlessly, long after the last battle has faded into memory. Wars are remembered for battles, treaties, and leaders, but their most enduring consequences are often invisible. Behind every major conflict that reshaped global power lay a transformation in how money moved, how debt was managed, and how economic authority was enforced. Modern global finance was not designed in peacetime boardrooms. It was built under the pressure of war, again and again, because war demands resources that ordinary political systems cannot generate. To understand today's global economic order, one must follow the trail of conflict. The Napoleonic Wars offer an early example. Britain did not defeat France solely through battlefield success. It defeated France by sustaining war longer. That endurance rested on credit. Britain developed sophisticated public debt instruments, backed by parliamentary legitimacy and a stable tax base. Investors trusted the British state to repay its loans, even under extreme strain. This trust became power. While France struggled with inflation and fiscal instability, Britain financed coalitions across Europe. Victory was not purchased with soldiers alone, but with bonds. By 1815, Britain emerged not just militarily victorious, but financially dominant, its currency, institutions, and banking practices shaping global commerce. This model would be repeated. The Opium Wars and subsequent imperial conflicts reinforced the link between military force and financial extraction. Control over ports, tariffs, and trade routes translated directly into revenue streams. Colonies were not only territories, they were balance sheets. Yet it was the world wars that fundamentally reshaped global finance. The First World War forced governments to mobilize entire economies. Gold standards collapsed under the strain. States borrowed at unprecedented levels. Inflation soared. War debt altered political priorities long after the fighting ended. Europe emerged from the war financially weakened and deeply indebted. The United States emerged as the world's principal creditor. This shift was not incidental. American entry into the war transformed the U.S. economy into a global supplier of capital, weapons, and food. European powers borrowed heavily to sustain their war efforts. After the war, repayment obligations bound Europe to American financial institutions. Global power was shifting quietly, from armies to ledgers. The Great Depression exposed the fragility of this system. War debts, reparations, and economic nationalism created a feedback loop of instability. Financial collapse undermined political systems, contributing directly to the rise of extremist movements and the outbreak of the Second World War. Once again, war would force a reordering. During the Second World War, the United States assumed financial leadership deliberately. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 established a new global monetary system anchored by the U.S. dollar. Institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were designed to prevent the economic chaos that had followed the First World War, but they also reflected power realities. Voting structures favored wealthy states. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. Access to capital became tied to alignment with the emerging Western order. This system was not imposed solely through force. It was made credible by American industrial capacity, military reach, and political stability. War had demonstrated that economic collapse was a security threat. Financial governance became an instrument of global order. The Cold War intensified this connection. Economic systems became ideological battlegrounds. Aid programs, trade agreements, and development loans were tools of influence. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe while binding it to American markets. Soviet economic assistance served similar purposes within its sphere. Debt, aid, and investment replaced colonial administration. Yet this shift created new dependencies. Many newly independent states emerged from decolonization with fragile economies. Development loans promised growth, but often entrenched vulnerability. When global interest rates rose in the 1970s and 1980s, debt crises followed. Structural adjustment programs imposed austerity, reshaping domestic policies in the name of financial stability. This was power exercised without troops. War had created the institutions. Peace allowed them to operate. Even in the post-Cold War era, the pattern persists. Military interventions are often accompanied by financial restructuring. Sanctions function as economic sieges. Access to global markets becomes conditional. Currency stability becomes a strategic concern. The wars in the Middle East, the expansion of NATO, and the rise of China all intersect with financial power. Infrastructure investments, trade corridors, and debt diplomacy shape influence as decisively as military bases. What emerges is a consistent pattern. War expands the state. It demands centralized authority, mass taxation, and public debt. In doing so, it creates financial institutions that outlive the conflict. These institutions then shape global order in quieter but no less powerful ways. Modern global finance is therefore not neutral. It reflects historical asymmetries created by conflict. States that won wars or emerged strengthened by them wrote the rules. States weakened by war entered the system as borrowers rather than architects. Understanding this history complicates simplistic narratives. Global inequality is not merely a function of culture or governance. It is embedded in systems forged under extreme pressure. Financial power flows from political power, which flows, ultimately, from war. This does not mean war is inevitable or desirable. It means that the structures governing peace were built in its shadow. As new powers rise and old ones adapt, financial systems will again become arenas of competition. Currency dominance, debt sustainability, and economic resilience are no longer abstract concerns. They are strategic imperatives. The echoes of empire are audible in interest rates, trade agreements, and capital flows. And, as history suggests, when financial systems strain under geopolitical pressure, conflict often follows, not immediately, but inevitably. Few legacies of imperial warfare have proven as enduring or as destructive as borders. Lines drawn in the aftermath of wars have a way of outliving the empires that created them. They persist through revolutions, regime changes, and international systems, often hardening into sources of permanent tension. To understand why so many modern conflicts appear frozen, cyclical, or impossible to resolve, one must examine how war shaped borders and how those borders shaped states. Modern borders are rarely organic. They are products of conflict, negotiation, and compromise conducted under pressure, often by distant powers with limited knowledge of local realities. The wars that defined global power structures also defined political geography in ways that prioritized strategic convenience over social coherence. The Middle East offers perhaps the clearest illustration. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War created a vacuum that European powers rushed to fill. Britain and France, operating under wartime agreements such as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, divided the region into spheres of influence. Borders were drawn with rulers and maps rather than populations in mind. These lines were not designed to produce stable states. They were designed to manage imperial competition. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan emerged as political entities with little historical precedent as unified nation-states. Diverse ethnic, religious, and tribal communities were incorporated into centralized systems modeled on European governance. Authority was maintained through coercion rather than consent. This arrangement held only as long as imperial backing remained. When colonial powers withdrew, the structures they left behind lacked legitimacy. Conflict was not a failure of these states, it was the predictable outcome of their design. A similar process unfolded in Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884–85 formalized the partition of the continent among European powers, but it was war, both imperial and global, that later froze these borders into permanence. Independence movements inherited colonial boundaries because redrawing them risked endless conflict. The result was a continent of states whose borders often cut across ethnic, linguistic, and cultural lines. Post-independence wars in Nigeria, the Congo, Sudan, and elsewhere were not random outbreaks of violence. They were struggles over political authority in spaces never designed for cohesive governance. In South Asia, the legacy of wartime decision-making proved equally profound. The hurried partition of British India in 1947, conducted amid imperial withdrawal and mounting violence, created India and Pakistan as separate states. Borders were drawn in weeks, not years. Millions were displaced. Communal violence killed over 1 million people. The conflict did not end with independence. Kashmir remains contested decades later. Wars between India and Pakistan have shaped regional security dynamics and nuclear proliferation. The original partition, shaped by imperial priorities and wartime exhaustion, continues to define South Asian geopolitics. Eastern Europe and the Balkans tell a parallel story. The First World War dismantled empires and created new states, often without stable foundations. The Second World War imposed new borders again, enforced by military occupation and ideological alignment. When the Cold War ended, suppressed tensions resurfaced violently, as in the breakup of Yugoslavia. The pattern is consistent. Wars create borders under conditions of urgency and imbalance. Those borders become institutions. Over time, they harden into identities. Challenging them becomes synonymous with challenging international order itself. This creates a paradox. Many modern conflicts persist precisely because altering borders is deemed more dangerous than enduring instability. International law prioritizes territorial integrity over historical justice or social cohesion. The result is a world of artificial states locked into unresolved tensions. These tensions are not merely local. They shape global power structures by creating regions of chronic instability where external powers intervene selectively. Conflicts become opportunities for influence. Peace becomes conditional. The Cold War intensified this dynamic by freezing borders through proxy conflicts. The post-Cold War era inherited these frozen conflicts without the rigid stability that once contained them. Ukraine, for example, sits at the intersection of competing historical narratives, strategic interests, and imperial legacies. Its borders reflect Soviet-era decisions shaped by wartime politics. The conflict that erupted in the 21st century cannot be understood without tracing those decisions back through the Second World War and the Cold War. Similarly, conflicts in the Middle East are often framed as ancient or religious. In reality, many are rooted in 20th-century wars and the borders they produced. Sectarian tensions were politicized through colonial governance and post-war state formation. War thus creates geography, and geography creates war. Once established, borders shape military planning, economic development, and national identity. They determine who is inside and who is excluded. They become symbols worth fighting over, even when they were originally drawn arbitrarily. This does not mean borders are immutable, but changing them peacefully requires legitimacy, consent, and international support. Conditions rarely present where borders are most contested. Global power structures reinforce this rigidity. Major powers benefit from predictability. Stability, even unstable stability, is often preferred to redrawing maps. As a result, many conflicts are managed rather than resolved. Understanding this history challenges simplistic explanations. Persistent conflict is not evidence of failure to modernize or integrate. It is often the legacy of wars that prioritized strategic advantage over sustainable governance. The echoes of empire are visible on every political map. They remind us that war's most lasting impact is not destruction, but design. Borders drawn under fire do not fade with time. They accumulate meaning, resentment, and power. And as long as global order rests on these inherited lines, the conflicts they contain will continue to shape international politics, quietly, persistently, and at times explosively. Every major transformation in global power has been accompanied, often driven, by a transformation in technology. Wars accelerate this process. They compress innovation, force adoption, and expose weaknesses with unforgiving clarity. What emerges after conflict is rarely limited to new weapons. It is a reconfiguration of how societies organize knowledge, labor, and authority. Modern global power structures cannot be understood without tracing how war reshaped technology, and how technology, in turn, reshaped war. The 19th century marked the first great convergence. Railways, telegraphs, and industrial manufacturing altered the scale and speed of conflict. Armies could be mobilized faster, supplies could be moved across continents. Commanders could coordinate forces beyond line of sight. Wars ceased to be seasonal and local. They became continuous and expansive. The American Civil War demonstrated this shift vividly. Rail networks determined strategic possibilities. Telegraph lines connected political leadership directly to the front. Industrial production sustained prolonged combat. Victory belonged not only to generals, but to engineers, factory managers, and logisticians. European powers took note. By the time of the First World War, technology had transformed warfare into a system. Artillery dominated battlefields, machine guns neutralized massed infantry, chemical weapons introduced new forms of terror, aviation, initially experimental, expanded reconnaissance and bombing. The war revealed a grim truth. Technological advantage did not guarantee decisive victory. It often produced stalemate. Trench warfare emerged not from strategic conservatism alone, but from the overwhelming power of defensive technology. Industrial war became a contest of endurance, measured in production capacity rather than maneuver. This realization reshaped global power. States that could mobilize science, industry, and population most effectively gained structural advantage. Those that could not adapt fell behind, regardless of bravery or tradition. The Second World War intensified this dynamic dramatically. Radar, cryptography, mechanized warfare, and strategic bombing transformed conflict. The Manhattan Project introduced nuclear weapons, altering the meaning of victory and defeat. For the first time, technological supremacy threatened not just armies, but civilization itself. After 1945, technology became inseparable from deterrence. Nuclear arsenals imposed constraints on great power war. Missiles, submarines, and early warning systems created a fragile balance. Power rested not in using weapons, but in convincing adversaries they would never be used lightly. This technological standoff reshaped diplomacy, alliance systems, and global strategy. Yet technology did not freeze conflict. It redirected it. During the Cold War, conventional wars persisted at the periphery. Helicopters, surveillance aircraft, and electronic warfare altered counterinsurgency. Guerrilla movements adapted technology creatively, exploiting asymmetries. Technology did not eliminate human factors. It magnified them. The late 20th century introduced a new phase. Computing, satellites, and digital communications transformed both civilian life and military operations. Precision-guided munitions promised cleaner wars. Networked command systems compressed decision-making timelines. The Gulf War reinforced the perception that technology had restored decisive warfare. This perception proved misleading. While advanced states gained overwhelming battlefield superiority, Their political objectives became harder to achieve. Technology could destroy targets, but not construct legitimacy. Information flowed faster than control. This tension defines contemporary conflict. Today, global power is exercised increasingly through technological ecosystems rather than territorial occupation. Cyber operations disrupt infrastructure without crossing borders. Surveillance technologies enable control without visible force. Artificial intelligence accelerates decision-making while obscuring accountability. War has not disappeared. It has become more continuous, more ambiguous. Algorithms now shape targeting decisions. Data flows determine economic resilience, control of digital infrastructure. Rivals control of physical terrain. States compete for technological standards, supply chains, and intellectual property. These struggles are deeply rooted in earlier wars. The institutions governing technology, research funding, industrial coordination, security classification were built during periods of intense conflict. The military-industrial complex is not an abstraction. It is a historical outcome of sustained mobilization. Power accrues to those who shape technological environments. This has implications for global hierarchy. States with advanced technological ecosystems gain leverage across domains: military, economic, informational. States without them become dependent, vulnerable, or marginalized. This dynamic mirrors earlier patterns. Just as industrialization once separated empires from colonies, digital technology now separates core powers from the periphery. Access to innovation, education, and infrastructure determines position within the global order. Technology also reshapes legitimacy. Public perception of war changes when violence becomes remote, precise, and mediated through screens. Accountability diffuses. Decision-makers operate at greater distance from consequences. Yet technology does not eliminate uncertainty. It increases it. Cyber conflict lacks clear thresholds. Escalation is ambiguous. Attribution is contested. The very tools designed to increase control introduce new forms of instability. The echoes of earlier technological revolutions are unmistakable. Railways enabled empire. Telegraphs centralized authority. Nuclear weapons constrained war. Digital networks fragmented. Each phase alters global power structures not by replacing old conflicts, but by transforming how they unfold. The critical insight is this: technology does not determine outcomes on its own. It interacts with institutions, culture, and historical memory. Wars accelerate technological change, but societies decide how those changes are used. As emerging technologies reshape conflict yet again, the lessons of the past remain relevant. Power gained through innovation is temporary unless embedded within legitimate, adaptable systems. Wars expose this reality brutally. The next question is not whether technology will continue to change warfare. It will. The question is whether global power structures, shaped by centuries of conflict, can adapt without repeating the same cycle of destruction that created them. Power, on its own, is never enough. History shows repeatedly that military victory does not automatically translate into authority, and authority does not endure without legitimacy. The wars that shaped today's global power structures did more than elevate certain states. They determined which forms of power would be tolerated, normalized, or resisted by the wider world. Legitimacy is not a moral abstraction, it is a practical condition. It determines whether power must be enforced continuously or whether it is accepted with minimal resistance. War plays a decisive role in shaping this balance. In the 19th century, imperial powers rarely questioned their own legitimacy. Military success was understood as proof of right. Britain's global dominance after the Napoleonic Wars was not framed as conquest, but as stewardship. Control of trade routes, colonies, and financial systems was justified through narratives of order, progress, and civilization. These narratives mattered. They allowed power to operate with relatively limited force. Colonial administrators governed vast territories with surprisingly small numbers, relying on local intermediaries, legal systems, and economic incentives. Resistance existed, but it was often fragmented and localized. This legitimacy was not universal, but it was sufficient. The First World War disrupted this arrangement profoundly. The rhetoric used to mobilize populations, self-determination, national rights, popular sovereignty, could not be easily contained once the war ended. Colonized peoples listened closely. The language of legitimacy turned inward on the empires that had wielded it. War had undermined the moral foundations of imperial rule. The Second World War accelerated this collapse. Fascist aggression discredited overt imperial domination. Anti-colonial movements aligned themselves rhetorically with the Allies' stated principles. When European powers emerged weakened and indebted, their claims to legitimate authority rang hollow. Yet, legitimacy did not disappear. It changed form. The United States emerged from the Second World War with immense power and comparatively high legitimacy. This was not accidental. America framed its dominance as defensive rather than imperial, institutional rather than territorial. Alliances replaced colonies. Economic integration replaced direct rule. Institutions such as the United Nations, the IMF, and the World Bank were not neutral creations. They embedded American preferences into global governance. But they also provided a framework through which power appeared rule-based rather than arbitrary. This distinction mattered enormously. States aligned with the U.S.-led order did not feel occupied, even when dependent. The system offered stability, access, and growth, unevenly distributed, but real. Legitimacy flowed not from force alone, but from perceived benefit. By contrast, Soviet power struggled with legitimacy beyond its immediate sphere. While the Soviet Union commanded immense military and ideological influence, its authority relied more heavily on coercion. In Eastern Europe, legitimacy was enforced rather than earned. When pressure eased, resistance emerged quickly, as seen in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. The Cold War revealed a critical insight. Power that relies primarily on fear is brittle. Power that embeds itself into daily life through economic opportunity, institutional participation, and cultural influence is far more resilient. Decolonization wars exposed this contrast vividly. Former colonial powers often retained military superiority but lost legitimacy irreversibly. Even victories on the battlefield could not restore authority once the moral framework collapsed. Independence movements succeeded not because they were always stronger, but because imperial rule could no longer justify itself convincingly. This lesson echoes into the present. Post-Cold War interventions frequently failed, not due to lack of power, but lack of legitimacy. Military occupation without local consent produced resistance. Efforts to impose political systems externally faltered when they lacked cultural grounding and historical continuity. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan illustrate this dynamic sharply. In both cases, initial military success was followed by prolonged instability. External power removed regimes, but could not replace legitimacy. Local populations did not universally accept new political arrangements, especially when they appeared aligned with foreign interests. This was not a failure of intention alone. It was a failure to understand how legitimacy is constructed. Legitimacy arises from shared narratives, historical continuity, and perceived fairness. War can destroy legitimacy faster than it can create it. Once lost, it is extremely difficult to rebuild from the outside. Global power structures today reflect this reality. The influence of the United States remains substantial, but it is contested more openly than in the late 20th century. Legitimacy has eroded in some regions due to perceived overreach, inconsistency, or hypocrisy. At the same time, alternative powers struggle to present models that inspire trust rather than fear. China's rise illustrates a new approach. Rather than framing power through military alliances or ideological export, China emphasizes economic partnership and non-interference. Infrastructure investment and trade create dependency, but also tangible benefit. Legitimacy is cultivated pragmatically rather than rhetorically. Yet this model faces limits as well. Economic influence without political participation generates resentment. Debt dependency raises concerns. Soft power is constrained by censorship and political rigidity. Legitimacy remains conditional. Russia's approach, by contrast, relies more openly on coercion and historical grievance. Military intervention asserts influence quickly, but struggles to secure long-term acceptance. Power is demonstrated, but rarely embraced. These contrasts reveal a fundamental truth shaped by centuries of war. The most durable global power structures are those that make themselves appear necessary rather than imposed. War can open the door to dominance, but legitimacy determines whether that dominance lasts. Today's global order sits at an inflection point. The institutions forged by war still exist, but their authority is questioned. New powers challenge old hierarchies. Public opinion travels faster than military force. Narratives compete in real time. The echoes of empire remind us that legitimacy is not permanent. It must be renewed, or it erodes. Wars define who has power. Legitimacy defines whether that power can endure, and history suggests that when legitimacy collapses, conflict follows, not because power disappears, but because it must once again be enforced by force. Rising powers do not emerge into a historical vacuum. They carry memories of defeat, humiliation, fragmentation, and survival that shape how they interpret the present and imagine the future. These memories are not abstract. They are embedded in education systems, political rhetoric, strategic doctrine, and public expectations. The wars that once defined global power continue to define how rising states understand legitimacy, security, and destiny. History, in this sense, is not behind them. It is active. China offers the clearest illustration of how historical memory shapes contemporary power. Modern Chinese statecraft cannot be understood without reference to the 19th and early 20th centuries, the period often described domestically as the century of humiliation. Beginning with the Opium Wars and ending with the Japanese invasion during the Second World War, China experienced repeated military defeat, territorial loss, and external domination. These wars did not merely weaken China materially. They shattered assumptions about cultural superiority, sovereignty, and order. Foreign powers imposed unequal treaties, controlled ports, and dictated trade. The Qing dynasty collapsed under the strain. The modern Chinese state emerged from revolution, civil war, and foreign occupation. This historical experience profoundly shapes Chinese strategic thinking. Territorial integrity is non-negotiable. External interference is viewed with deep suspicion. Economic strength is treated as a prerequisite for security. Long-term planning is prioritized over short-term gain. When China invests in infrastructure abroad or asserts claims in surrounding seas, these actions are often framed domestically not as expansion, but as restoration, correcting historical imbalance rather than creating new dominance. This does not make such actions benign, but it explains their intensity. Russia's relationship with historical memory is similarly complex. The Russian state emerged repeatedly from devastation: the Napoleonic invasion, the First World War, the Russian Civil War, the Second World War. Each conflict inflicted immense loss. Each reinforced the belief that vulnerability invites catastrophe. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 is often remembered in Russia not as liberation, but as disintegration. Territory was lost, influence evaporated, economic hardship followed. NATO expansion into Eastern Europe was interpreted not as defensive alignment, but as encroachment into spaces historically linked to Russian security. This memory shapes contemporary Russian strategy. Control over buffer zones, resistance to external military alliances near its borders, and emphasis on sovereignty reflect a worldview forged by war and collapse. Military intervention is framed domestically as prevention rather than aggression. Again, this does not justify such actions, but it reveals their roots. India, too, is shaped by the legacy of war. Colonial rule ended amid violence and partition. Wars with Pakistan and China in the decades following independence reinforced perceptions of vulnerability. Border disputes inherited from imperial cartography remain unresolved. As India rises economically and strategically, it balances ambition with caution. Strategic autonomy is emphasized. Alliances are pursued selectively. Historical experience discourages dependence on any single power. These memories shape India's approach to global power, measured, incremental, and deeply conscious of sovereignty. Even the United States is not exempt from historical memory. Its rise was shaped by war, independence through revolution, consolidation through civil war, emergence through global conflict. Victory in the Second World War created a narrative of moral leadership and indispensable power. This narrative influences American expectations. Intervention is often framed as responsibility rather than ambition. Failure is interpreted as anomaly rather than structural limitation. Historical success fosters confidence, but sometimes blinds policymakers to changing conditions. Historical memory thus functions as both guide and constraint. Rising powers interpret the global order through the lens of past wars, especially those in which they suffered loss or exclusion. Established powers interpret challenges through memories of dominance and sacrifice. This creates misalignment. Actions intended as defensive are perceived as aggressive. Institutions designed to preserve order are viewed as instruments of exclusion. Dialogue becomes difficult when historical experiences diverge so sharply. Global power structures, forged through war, amplify this tension. Institutions created by victors reflect their values and assumptions. Rising powers inherit these structures without having shaped them. Participation feels conditional. Reform feels necessary but difficult. This is why rivalry today often centers on legitimacy rather than territory. Who sets the rules? Who defines norms? Whose history is acknowledged? These questions matter because history confers moral weight. The echoes of empire are strongest where memories of subjugation remain unresolved. They resurface in disputes over borders, trade, technology, and security arrangements. The danger is not memory itself. The danger is when memory hardens into grievance without dialogue. Wars once redrew the world through force. Today, power struggles increasingly unfold through narratives about the past, about who was wronged, who owes whom, and who has the right to lead. Understanding this dynamic is essential. Rising powers are not simply reacting to present incentives, they are responding to historical trajectories shaped by conflict. Ignoring this context leads to miscalculation. History does not repeat mechanically, but it echoes. And when those echoes are dismissed, they grow louder, sometimes violently. As global power becomes more distributed, managing historical memory becomes as important as managing military capability. Stability depends not only on deterrence, but on recognition. The final challenge, then, is not whether rising powers will reshape the global order. They will. The question is whether that transformation will occur through adaptation or through the kind of conflict that once created the order now under strain. It is tempting to believe that the wars which shaped global power lie firmly in the past. After all, most empires have collapsed. Colonial flags no longer fly over vast territories. The language of international relations emphasizes cooperation, rules, and norms rather than conquest. Yet the patterns of conflict unfolding today suggest something more unsettling. The age of empire did not end so much as fracture, leaving behind fault lines that continue to shift beneath our feet. The present moment feels unstable not because history has accelerated, but because its unresolved structures are under strain. The war in Ukraine offers a stark example. On the surface, it appears as a contemporary geopolitical conflict driven by security concerns, alliances, and national identity. Beneath that surface lie layers of imperial history. Ukraine's borders reflect decisions made during the Soviet era, itself a product of Revolutionary War and post-Second World War settlement. Russian strategic thinking is shaped by centuries of invasion and collapse. Western responses are informed by Cold War precedents and post-war institutional commitments. This war is not a return to empire. It is an aftershock. It reveals how borders drawn by past wars remain contested when the power structures that enforce them weaken. It exposes the tension between sovereignty as principle and influence as practice. It demonstrates how historical memory can turn strategic calculation into existential confrontation. The Middle East presents a similar pattern. Conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Israel-Palestine are often explained through ideology or religion. While these factors matter, they do not explain why violence persists across generations. The deeper explanation lies in the imperial collapse of the early 20th century and the wars that followed. States were created without social cohesion. Authority relied on coercion. External powers intervened repeatedly, reshaping balances without resolving legitimacy. Each conflict layered new grievances atop old ones. The result is not perpetual chaos, but chronic instability, periods of violence followed by uneasy pause. Asia, too, bears imperial aftershocks. Tensions in the South China Sea reflect unresolved legacies of colonial boundaries, wartime occupation, and Cold War division. Taiwan's status is inseparable from the Chinese Civil War and the global conflict that froze its outcome. Korea remains divided not by ideology alone, but by a war that never formally ended. In each case, today's crises are not anomalies, they are continuations. Africa's conflicts tell a quieter but no less important story. Borders drawn during imperial partition persist despite weak internal cohesion. Wars of independence were followed by proxy conflicts, coups, and civil wars shaped by Cold War rivalry. External intervention continues under the banners of peacekeeping, counterterrorism, or development. Yet the underlying structure remains. States struggle to consolidate authority within borders they did not design. Power remains centralized and contested. External actors manage symptoms rather than causes. Even in regions often seen as stable, aftershocks are visible. Europe's political cohesion relies on institutions built after catastrophic wars. These institutions succeeded because the memory of destruction was fresh and shared. As that memory fades, consensus weakens. Economic crises and security challenges test solidarity. The rise of nationalist movements reflects not just contemporary grievances, but unresolved questions about sovereignty, identity, and legitimacy. Questions that wars once settled temporarily through force. The global system itself shows signs of strain. Institutions created after the Second World War assumed a specific distribution of power and shared commitment to their preservation. That distribution is changing. Commitment is uneven. Rules designed for one era struggle to adapt to another. This does not mean the system is collapsing. It means it is adjusting under pressure. The aftershocks of empire are felt most strongly where power shifts fastest. Rising states challenge rules they did not write. Established powers resist change framed as erosion. Smaller states navigate uncertainty, balancing autonomy against security. Conflict emerges not because war is desired, but because inherited structures no longer align with present realities. Technology accelerates this process. Information spreads instantly. Narratives compete globally. Historical grievances are amplified rather than contained. Military escalation can occur rapidly, even accidentally, yet restraint persists. Despite intense rivalry, major powers avoid direct war. Nuclear deterrence, economic interdependence, and institutional inertia impose limits. These constraints themselves are legacies of past wars. We are living in a paradoxical moment. The world is more interconnected than ever, yet more fragmented in perception. Violence is widespread but uneven. Power is diffuse but asymmetrical. This is what aftershocks look like. They do not replicate the original earthquake. They release accumulated stress along old fault lines. Understanding this helps explain why contemporary conflicts resist simple solutions. Peace cannot be imposed where legitimacy is contested. Stability cannot be achieved where borders remain symbolic rather than consensual. Cooperation falters when historical memory diverges. The lesson of the past is not that war inevitably returns, it is that unresolved structures eventually demand adjustment. The question facing the present generation is whether that adjustment will occur through reform, or through the kind of conflict that once created the very order now under strain. History offers no guarantees, but it offers warning. Empires fell not because they were evil or benevolent, but because their structures no longer matched reality. The wars that replaced them reshaped the world violently. If the echoes of empire are ignored, they grow louder. If they are understood, they can be managed. The final task is to ask not whether war still defines global power, but whether humanity has learned enough from its history to prevent war from doing so again. The question that lingers after tracing centuries of conflict is not simply whether war shaped global power. It did. The deeper question is whether it must continue to do so. History does not offer an easy answer. It offers patterns, recurring, stubborn, and deeply human. Every global power structure examined in this documentary emerged from war or was transformed by it. Empires rose through conquest, stabilized through coercion, and collapsed under the strain of conflict they could no longer manage. Yet the very repetition of this cycle invites reflection. If war has been the engine of structural change, It has also been the instrument through which humanity repeatedly discovers its limits. Each era believes it has mastered power, only to confront consequences that exceed intention. The Napoleonic Wars revealed that mass mobilization could reorder the world, but also that such mobilization could not be contained indefinitely. The Opium Wars demonstrated that economic coercion could replace conquest, but at the cost of legitimacy and long-term stability. The World Wars destroyed empires and created institutions meant to prevent repetition, institutions that now struggle under new pressures. The Cold War showed that catastrophic war could be avoided through restraint, yet only by displacing violence elsewhere. Decolonization ended formal empire, but left behind states shaped by the wars that birthed them. The post-Cold War era promised peace through dominance, only to reveal the limits of unilateral power. These outcomes suggest that war has functioned less as a solution than as a reset. It resolves immediate contradictions while generating new ones. This raises an uncomfortable possibility that war has persisted not because it is effective, but because global systems have struggled to adapt without it. Power, historically, has required enforcement. Legitimacy has often followed victory rather than preceding it. Institutions have been built by those who prevailed, then defended as universal. Yet the conditions that once made this cycle tolerable no longer exist. Industrial war nearly destroyed civilization. Nuclear weapons made repetition unthinkable. Economic interdependence ensures that major conflict would reverberate globally in ways no state could control. The old methods are obsolete, but the structures remain. Global power today operates through influence rather than occupation, through finance rather than tribute, through norms rather than decrees. Yet these mechanisms are still shaped by historical inequality. They still privilege those who benefited from past wars. The challenge, then, is not to erase history. It is to transcend its most destructive habits. This requires confronting difficult truths. That global order is not neutral. That legitimacy cannot be assumed indefinitely. That rising powers are not aberrations, but outcomes of historical processes long underway. It also requires recognizing that peace is not merely the absence of war. Peace is the presence of adaptable systems capable of absorbing change without violence. History suggests this is rare, but not impossible. Moments of transition have occurred without global war. Institutions have been reformed. Norms have evolved. Power has shifted gradually rather than catastrophically. These moments are fragile but real. The future of global power will be shaped not by a single decisive conflict, but by countless choices made under pressure, whether disputes are managed or militarized, whether institutions are reformed or rigidly defended, whether history is acknowledged or weaponized. The echoes of empire remind us that wars do not fade when the fighting ends. They persist in borders, in institutions, in memories, and in assumptions about how the world works. Ignoring those echoes does not silence them, it amplifies them. Understanding them, however, offers a different possibility. Not certainty, not permanence, but awareness. Awareness that power is not destiny, that dominance carries responsibility, that legitimacy must be earned repeatedly, not inherited. The wars that defined today's global power structures were fought under conditions their participants could not fully comprehend. Their consequences shaped a world none of them could foresee. The present generation has the advantage of hindsight and the burden of choice. Whether future historians will describe this era as another turning point forged by war, or as a moment when humanity learned to adapt without repeating its most destructive patterns, remains unresolved. History does not close with certainty, it pauses. And in that pause lies the possibility that the echoes of empire might finally fade, not through forgetting, but through understanding.